When a former Marine tried to clear an old red mound on his dying farm, he thought he was just searching for water. But when the bulldozer roared, Ranger, his loyal shepherd, went wild, barking at something buried deep below. And when Eli's shovel struck cold steel engraved with Project Triton 1959, he realized it wasn't about water. It was about a secret meant to stay buried forever. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe. Stay to receive the next stories of faith and loyalty. May God bless all who stand for truth, justice, and mercy. The morning sun of Red Hollow, New Mexico, rose pale and strained behind a curtain of desert dust. The air was still, the kind of stillness that felt suspicious, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Beneath the ridge, Eli Morgan leaned against the faded yellow excavator, sweat already tracing a path through the grit on his face. The 45-year-old former Marine had the kind of build that looked carved rather than grown: broad shoulders, sun-creased eyes, and a jawline shadowed by 2 days of stubble. His short brown hair, flecked with gray, stuck out unevenly beneath his cap. He carried himself with the deliberate quiet of someone who had seen too much and learned to fear silence more than noise. The drought had stretched on for 9 months. Wells had gone dry, the cattle thinned out, and the banks were circling like vultures. Eli's ranch, the last piece of his family's legacy, was dying. The only patch of ground left untouched by his desperation was the red mound in the northern pasture, a jagged rise of clay the locals called the Sleeping Hill. He'd always avoided it, mostly because his late father had told him to. But today wasn't a day for superstition. Today was for survival. A soft thud broke his thoughts. Ranger, his German shepherd, stood a few feet away, tail stiff, ears pricked toward the mound. The dog was 7 years old, large and powerfully built, his fur a striking mix of black and silver-white, almost wolfish in sunlight. He had been Eli's partner since Afghanistan, a rescue turned protector. In the war, Ranger had saved his unit twice from shrapnel once and from Eli's own spiral into silence the second time. "Easy, boy," Eli muttered, stepping toward the cab. But the dog's low growl deepened. His hackles lifted, pupils narrowing, as if the earth itself offended him. Ranger lunged forward, barking wildly, planting his body between the bulldozer and the mound. Dust scattered under his claws. Eli frowned. Ranger wasn't the kind of dog to panic. In fact, he rarely barked at all. That single primal sound, the deep warning growl, brought back a tremor of memory. Ranger in the field, barking seconds before the roadside bomb went off. Eli froze, his fingers tightening around the excavator's lever. "What is it, Ranger?" he whispered. But the dog only barked harder, glancing from Eli to the ground as if begging him to understand. For a long moment, the only sounds were the wind and Ranger's desperate barking. Then Eli, driven by a mix of irritation and unease, stepped off the machine. "All right, we'll see what's got your tail in a twist." He grabbed his steel shovel, the handle polished by years of use, and walked to the spot where Ranger had dug a shallow furrow. The earth here was different, harder, heavier. Eli pressed the shovel into the soil and leaned his weight onto it. The first strike hit something solid, not rock metal. A hollow clang echoed through the air. Ranger let out a sharp, whining bark and began circling Eli again, paws slicing through dust. He knelt, scraping with his hands, until the red clay gave way to a dull gray surface. A faint line appeared beneath his thumb. Then another crossed wings, a star, and a faint inscription burned into the steel by time and sand. As the soil fell away, the full emblem emerged: Project Triton 1959, U.S. Navy. Eli's breath caught. He brushed away the last of the clay and froze. Just below the letters, barely legible, was a name scratched by hand into the metal. Capt. John Morgan. His father. The sound that followed was so soft it could have been imagined a hiss, like air escaping from something sealed too long. The ground vibrated faintly beneath his boots. Ranger backed away, barking, his ears flat. Eli stepped backward, shovel raised instinctively, his throat tightening. For a heartbeat, it felt like the earth was breathing. A faint exhalation, metallic and cold, wafted up from the hatch. It smelled of rust and chemicals, sharp enough to sting the eyes. Then, silence again, thick and total. Eli crouched, fingers trembling as they traced the etched insignia. The symbol was authentic, he knew it instantly. His father had served in the Navy's engineering corps, a man of precision and pride. But John Morgan had never spoken of something called Project Triton. He had died when Eli was 12, of what the doctors called a heart attack. The same year this land passed into Eli's name. The same year his nightmares began. Dad. The word came out dry, unsteady. He swallowed, staring at the hatch, as if it might answer. What did you build out here? He stood, brushing off his hands, and glanced at the horizon. The wind had shifted, sweeping in from the west, carrying a strange, static hum. It prickled at the back of his neck. Something about the air felt charged, heavy with memory and warning. Ranger paced beside him, whining, low. Not today, Eli said finally. We're not opening it today. He jammed the shovel into the ground, trying to sound practical, but his voice trembled. It's probably just an old water tank, that's all. But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. He couldn't. His father's name was carved into a sealed Navy hatch, buried 20 feet from his fence line. The mound wasn't just rock and clay, it was a grave, or a vault. And Eli's instincts, the same ones that had kept him alive in combat, whispered that whatever was inside wasn't meant to see daylight again. He turned toward the truck, wiping the sweat and clay from his hands. Ranger didn't move. The dog stood rigid, facing the hatch, ears forward, body tense, as if guarding it or warning it. The wind picked up again, sending thin streaks of dust swirling across the field. On the porch of the ranch house, a weathered mailbox clanged softly in the breeze. Inside were 3 unopened envelopes from the bank. Eli didn't have to open them to know what they said. He'd sold nearly everything worth selling, and the ranch was next. But now, standing there, staring back at that mound with the Navy emblem buried beneath, something inside him shifted. Maybe this was the answer. Maybe there was value here, old government tech, forgotten property, something he could use to save the land. Or maybe it was exactly what Ranger thought it was, a threat. He looked down at the dog, whose amber eyes met his own. You feel it too, don't you? Ranger didn't bark this time. He only let out a quiet, throaty whine and pressed his head against Eli's leg. The man reached down, his calloused hand resting on the dog's neck. Beneath the touch, he felt the steady pulse of a living thing, warm, loyal, and unafraid. Eli exhaled, eyes still on the mound. All right, he said softly. We'll wait till morning. Then we'll see what the Navy left behind. As he turned toward the house, the horizon shimmered faintly, a flicker of silver-blue light running under the surface of the mound, so brief it could have been lightning or something deeper. Ranger stopped mid-step, tail stiff, watching. The desert held its breath again. Night crept over Red Hollow like a tide of ash. The stars above were dim behind a veil of desert haze, and the air carried a faint metallic tang like the smell of wet copper. Eli Morgan stood once more before the mound, his lantern trembling faintly in his hand. He hadn't told anyone what he'd found. No one would have believed him anyway. Ranger sat nearby, his silhouette sharp against the red soil, eyes glinting with restless alertness. The dog had refused to enter the house all evening. Instead, he'd remained fixed on the mound, ears twitching at every whisper of wind. Eli's breath clouded in the cool air as he crouched by the hatch. The embossed Navy emblem was still visible beneath the thin layer of dust that had settled since morning. His pulse thudded in his ears. He had promised himself to wait until daylight, but something in him had shifted since sunset. He'd spent hours staring at his father's old photograph on the mantelpiece. Captain John Morgan, in uniform, standing tall beside a submarine docked under a pale sky. His smile small, but proud. A man who had served with honor. A man who, apparently, had buried something in his own backyard. Eli needed answers, not ghosts. He gripped the steel ring handle and pulled. The hatch didn't budge at first. Then, with a screech like metal tearing through bone, it cracked open. A rush of stale, cold air hit him full in the face, heavy with rust and the faint odor of oil and mold. Ranger growled, the low rumble echoing through the field. Eli swallowed his fear, set the lantern on the ground, and climbed down the steel ladder bolted to the shaft. Each rung moaned under his boots. When he reached the bottom, his light flickered across a small chamber, 10 feet by 10, its walls lined with riveted plates, flaking white paint, and rusted pipes that wept condensation. The beam of his lantern swept over shelves filled with decayed boxes, metal crates stamped with faded serial numbers, and a stack of navy blue binders swollen with moisture. The air was heavy, humid, as though the bunker had been breathing in the dark for decades. On a rusted desk in the corner lay a collection of personal items: a tarnished lighter, a compass, a cracked photo frame showing a much younger John Morgan standing beside a woman with kind eyes, Eli's mother. Beside it, an identification badge rested under a layer of grime. Capt. John E. Morgan, U.S. Navy Engineering Division. Eli reached out with shaking hands. "Dad," he whispered. His voice trembled, breaking the silence that had held the room hostage for 60 years. Then he saw it a small black reel-to-reel tape recorder, its casing mottled with age. The words, "Project Triton, Personal Log," were scratched faintly into its surface. He brushed the dust away, heart pounding. He connected the recorder to an old portable battery pack from the shelves, miraculously still functional, and pressed play. The tape whirred sluggishly. For, on a moment, there was only static. Then came the voice. It was unmistakable, steady, clipped, and deeply familiar, even after 3 decades of silence. Log entry, the 12th of August, 1959. Captain John Morgan reporting. Triton was meant to harness the geothermal veins under the basin. The theory was sound used the Earth's own heat to power the next generation of Navy reactors. But something went wrong. The tremors, they weren't from the machinery. They were from below. Eli's fingers clenched. The voice wavered slightly, as if his father had moved closer to the microphone. Triton isn't energy. It's a weapon. We didn't tap heat, we disturbed a living flow beneath the crust. The ocean water down here, it pulses like blood. They call it a geothermal vein, but I know what I heard. It was breathing. Eli's chest tightened. The tape crackled again, then continued. They told us to seal the site, to bury the conduit and silence everyone. But it won't hold. The ground is shifting. The Navy wants it forgotten, but they can't bury a heartbeat. The recording ended with a faint mechanical click. Ranger let out a low, warning growl, his ears snapping toward the narrow tunnel leading deeper into the bunker. Eli froze, holding his breath. The faintest vibration rolled through the metal floor beneath his boots, subtle but real. He switched off the recorder and pressed his hand against the steel. Another vibration came, like a pulse. Then, silence. He climbed the ladder quickly, heart racing, pulling the hatch closed behind him. As he stepped into the open air, Ranger stood rigid, staring toward the southern fence line. The night was still, too still. Then, a faint light flared against the horizon headlights. Eli crouched behind the bulldozer, the lantern's glow hidden. A black SUV rolled to a stop near the old dirt road that led to the highway. 2 figures sat inside. Through the glare of the windshield, he saw only silhouettes. The driver was tall, broad-shouldered, the passenger smaller, with her hair pulled back into a tight bun. The vehicle's engine idled quietly. Eli's hand drifted instinctively to his belt, where his sidearm used to hang. Old habits refused to die. The passenger door opened. A woman stepped out, her boots crunching softly on the gravel. Even at a distance, the glow of the headlights revealed her face, sharp features, pale skin flushed by the cold, and a mane of blonde hair tucked beneath a tan field jacket. She looked mid-30s, maybe younger, but her posture was military rigid and wary. She scanned the field with binoculars, her movements precise. After a long moment, she nodded toward the driver, then got back inside. The SUV reversed slowly, its lights dimming before disappearing down the road. Eli stayed crouched until the sound of the tires faded into the desert wind. When he finally stood, his knees were shaking. He turned toward the mound again. The air above it shimmered faintly, as if heat, waves were rising even in the cold. He knelt beside Ranger, resting a trembling hand on the dog's back. "They know," he whispered. "Someone knows we opened it." Ranger whined softly, his amber eyes reflecting the last sliver of moonlight. Eli looked back at the closed hatch. His father's voice still echoed in his head. "You can't bury a heartbeat." He wiped the sweat from his brow, though the air had turned cold enough to bite. The weight of the revelation pressed down on him, the truth his father had died to hide, the weapon buried beneath his own land. He could already feel the ground pulsing faintly again under his boots, rhythmic, alive. The wind shifted once more, bringing with it the faint smell of exhaust. Somewhere out there in the darkness, that black SUV had stopped again. This time, it wasn't watching. It was waiting. Eli turned toward the house, the lantern swinging in his hand. "Come on, boy," he said quietly. "We're not done yet." Ranger trotted. Beside him, tail low, glancing back once at the mound as though reluctant to turn his back on it. Behind them, the field lay silent, but the metal hatch gleamed faintly in the moonlight, breathing. Morning light bled softly over Red Hollow, pale and watery, as if the sun itself were reluctant to rise. The air smelled of iron and old rain. Eli stood by his pickup truck, a small glass jar clutched in his hand. Inside, the water from his well shimmered faintly under the light clear, yet carrying a subtle glow that made his stomach twist. Ranger sat in the passenger seat, panting lightly, his dark fur catching the dawn. The dog's eyes followed every movement Eli made, patient but uneasy, as though sensing the weight of what his master carried. By mid-morning, Eli arrived at the outskirts of the nearby town of Cedar Bend, a quiet settlement nestled between two ridges. The place was small enough that everyone knew everyone else, but large enough for one essential landmark, the weather-beaten Cedar Hollow Veterinary and Research Clinic. Its owner, Dr. Grace Harlow, was known to the locals not only as the town's only veterinarian, but also as a stubborn environmental biologist who never quite fit in. Eli parked outside and took a breath before stepping out. The bell over the clinic door jingled softly as he entered. Grace looked up from behind the counter, where she was sorting through a stack of blood samples under the hum of fluorescent lights. She was in her mid-30s, tall, with a lean, deliberate grace that came from years of working with restless animals. Her auburn hair was tied loosely at the nape of her neck, strands falling into a face both intelligent and faintly severe. Her skin carried the faint bronze of someone who spent as much time outdoors as in a lab. Behind her glasses, her eyes were sharp hazel flecked with green, the kind of eyes that saw details others missed. "Eli Morgan," she said, her voice soft but edged with curiosity. "Haven't seen you since last spring. You finally brought Ranger for his checkup?" He set the jar on the counter instead. "It's the water from my well," he said. "Something's wrong with it." Grace's brow furrowed. She lifted the jar carefully, holding it up to the light. The water refracted strangely, almost as if it held tiny shards of glass. "How long has it looked like this?" "Since last week. Cattle won't drink. Even Ranger avoids it." Her eyes flicked to the dog, who stood silently near the doorway, gaze fixed on the jar. You think it's contamination? I think it's something old, Eli said. From the Navy. From my father's time. Grace looked at him, searching his face. There was something raw there, grief that had aged into suspicion. John Morgan, she murmured. The one who worked with the Navy engineers, died in that accident, didn't he? Eli nodded. That's what they told us. Grace exhaled, the jar still in her hands. Let me run some tests. She disappeared into the back lab, her white coat fluttering behind her. The space smelled faintly of antiseptic and animal fur. Eli waited by the counter, fingers drumming nervously. On the wall hung a photograph of Grace with her father, a man in a ranger's uniform, broad-shouldered, smiling in the old-fashioned way men once did. A plaque beneath it read, Dr. Walter Harlow, Park Conservationist, 1,951,989. Eli remembered hearing the story years ago, how Grace's father had died trying to contain a wildfire near the ridge. The loss had hardened her, made her distrustful of official explanations. Half an hour later, she returned, holding a tablet in one hand and the now empty jar in the other. Her expression was grim. I ran a preliminary analysis, she said. There's strontium 90 inches, the sample. Eli frowned. That's radioactive. Not just radioactive, Grace corrected, sliding the tablet toward him. It's 20 times higher than the safe limit. This isotope doesn't just appear in groundwater, it's from nuclear testing, or an underground leak. The word hung between them like a live wire. Eli's jaw tightened. So my father's project, Triton, it wasn't about clean energy. She looked up sharply. What did you say? Project Triton, he repeated. I found a hatch buried under the North Pasture Navy insignia, my father's name, everything. There was a tape. He said Triton wasn't an energy experiment. It was a weapon. They disturbed something underground. Grace stared at him, disbelief flickering across her face, then softening into concern. Eli, if that's true, your land might still be leaking radiation. The aquifer could be contaminated for miles. Eli leaned back, running a hand over his face. This whole valley drinks from that spring. For a moment, neither spoke. The fluorescent light buzzed faintly overhead. Grace folded her arms, gaze distant. My father used to talk about strange tremors before the big fire, she murmured. He said the ground up by your property sounded alive like it was breathing under the soil. Everyone thought he was imagining things. Eli looked at her sharply. He wasn't. She met his eyes again, and something unspoken passed between them, a quiet understanding born of loss. Bring me another sample, she said. Deeper this time. And, Eli, if that hatch is really from the Navy, don't go back there alone. He nodded but said nothing. Rangers stirred beside him, ears flicking toward the window. A rumble of distant thunder, or maybe an engine, echoed faintly from outside. Grace turned toward the sound, her brow creasing. Probably a truck, Eli said, but he didn't believe it. The air had the same tautness as the night before, the kind that made every instinct scream danger. He thanked Grace, promised to return with another sample, and stepped out into the sunlight. The sky was bruising over, a curtain of gray rolling in from the west. Ranger jumped into the truck, whining softly. As Eli started the engine, he noticed the tire tracks in the mud along the fence, fresh, deep, and wide. The same pattern he'd seen behind the black SUV. He glanced toward the distant ridge, where a faint glint of metal caught the light before vanishing into the trees. He reached over and rested his hand on Ranger's neck. Looks like we've got company again, he muttered. The dog growled low in his throat, eyes fixed on the ridge as the wind carried the scent of rain and something else. Something metallic, faintly electric, like the smell of a storm that wasn't natural. The next day dawned with a brittle chill that seemed to hang over Cedar Bend like the echo of an unspoken warning. The fields were soaked with last night's rain, the red soil dark and heavy beneath Eli's boots. He had slept little. The words on the old Navy tape, and the memory of the black SUV gnawed at him like a splinter under the skin. Now he sat in his dimly lit kitchen, the single bulb flickering above the table. Spread before him were yellowed pages military reports, clippings, declassified memos he'd found in the county archives after sunrise. Ranger lay beside his chair, head on his paws, ears twitching at every distant sound. The documents told a story no one wanted to remember. Project Triton had been a naval experiment launched in the late 1950 seconds, aiming to harness seismic energy for sustainable power. But buried in the technical jargon were casualty lists, mentions of ground instability, and a single line that froze Eli's blood: Subject Area B. Contaminated. Personnel relocation. Initiated. The coordinates matched Red Hollow. He flipped to a newspaper clipping from 1960, Navy abandons subterranean facility after fatal incident. No names, no follow-up, just a photo of a fenced wasteland with a flag fluttering limply over it. The same flag he'd seen on the steel hatch. By mid-morning, Eli drove to Grace's clinic again, the truck rattling over the wet gravel roads. Grace was outside, loading medical supplies into her Jeep. Her hair was wind-tossed, the morning light catching copper highlights in it. When she saw Eli step out, her expression hardened with concern. "You look like you've been up all night." "I have," he said, handing her a file folder. "You need to see this." Inside, she found the newspaper clipping and a black and white photo of naval engineers standing beside a large steel cylinder, half buried in the ground. "That's the same design as your hatch," she said quietly. "They called it an energy project," Eli replied. "But it was a containment system. My father must have been the one who tried to stop them." Grace flipped through the documents. "You think that's why they erased him from the record?" He nodded. "They blamed him for the failure. Said he caused an explosion in the lab. But these reports say the breach came from below, not from human error." Before she could answer, Ranger let out a short bark. Both turned toward the dirt road. A black SUV was parked there again, the engine idling. Two men stepped out, their boots crunching over gravel. The taller one walked with an effortless confidence that came from authority. He was in his late 30s, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark tactical jacket and mirrored sunglasses despite the gray sky. His hair was cut short, the color of rusted iron. His face was angular, clean-shaven, with a faint scar across the chin. This was Cole Havers, and even before he spoke, Eli knew he wasn't a man, accustomed to being told no. The other, younger and leaner, stayed near the SUV, scanning the area. His name tag, barely visible, read Lang. He looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Cole's voice carried easily across the distance. "Mr. Morgan, Dr. Harlow, you've been digging where you shouldn't." Eli stiffened. "You're with the Navy?" Cole smiled faintly, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Not exactly. We represent Helion Dynamics, a private contractor under Federal Defense Authority. Our job is to secure retired research assets. What you found belongs to us." Grace crossed her arms, unflinching. "So you're saying contaminated groundwater and radioactive waste are your assets now?" Cole's tone hardened. "That's classified material. You're trespassing on restricted property." Eli took a step closer, jaw tight. "Restricted? My father built that site. His name's on the damn door." Cole adjusted his sunglasses, revealing eyes so pale they seemed almost colorless. "Then you should know better than to touch what he left buried." Ranger growled, a deep rumble vibrating through his chest. Cole's partner Lang shifted nervously, hand brushing the pistol at his hip, but Cole raised a finger, signaling him to stand down. "Nice dog," he said. "Smart enough to stay quiet, I hope." Eli's fists clenched. "If you're here to threaten me, do it plain." Cole tilted his head. "Threaten? No. I'm here to offer advice. Leave the hatch sealed. Forget what you think you found. The Navy already paid for those mistakes once. There's no need for a repeat performance. Grace stepped forward. And what happens if we don't? Cole's smile disappeared. Then we'll handle it ourselves. He turned and started back toward the SUV, boots splashing through puddles. Over his shoulder, he added, "The emblem you're so proud of. Mr. Morgan, it's not a symbol of honor anymore. It's a warning. Don't make the same mistake your father did." The SUV door slammed shut, the tires spinning mud as it pulled away down the road. For a long moment, neither Eli nor Grace spoke. The wind picked up, snapping through the branches, carrying with it the faint echo of the word warning. Grace exhaled slowly. They know exactly what's under that ground. Eli nodded, eyes fixed on the fading trail of the SUV. And they'll bury it again, even if they have to bury us with it. The clouds thickened overhead, the sky dimming to the color of lead. Ranger pressed against Eli's leg, growling softly as thunder rolled over the hills. In that sound, Eli thought he could almost hear it again, the deep, rhythmic pulse from the earth beneath Red Hollow. Like a heart still beating under the flag. The rain hadn't stopped for 2 days. It came in sheets across Red Hollow, flattening the grass and turning the dirt roads into narrow rivers of mud. Eli Morgan stood in his barn with Grace and Sheriff Nolan Pike, the single bulb above them casting long shadows across a table cluttered with maps, water samples, and the battered reel recorder that carried his father's voice. The place smelled of hay, oil, and stormwater seeping through the roof. Ranger lay near the doorway, his fur slick from the damp, eyes alert to every sound beyond the walls. Sheriff Nolan was a broad man in his 50s, with a square jaw framed by graying stubble and eyes the color of wet slate. Years of field work had left him with a limp and a patience that could break rocks. His uniform was clean but worn at the seams, his badge dulled by time. He'd been friends with Eli's father once, before the project that tore the town apart. Nolan rubbed his chin, staring at the scattered files. "You're telling me this whole damn valley's sitting on top of a naval test site that's leaking poison?" Grace nodded, arms folded tightly across her chest. "It's not just poison. The isotopes are still active. If Triton's reactor core cracked underground, the contamination could spread for decades." Nolan sighed. "And Helion Dynamics doesn't want that story getting out." "Figures. They've been under federal contracts since the 60s. Always 3 names away from whoever signs the checks." Eli leaned against the table, arms braced. "We've got the tape, the water readings, and Grace's lab report. If we can prove Triton's still active, we'll force an investigation." Nolan frowned. "That's a big if. They'll bury this before it hits daylight." Eli's gaze hardened. "Not if we get it out first." The sheriff studied him a moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll help you, Eli. But we need to be careful. Helion plays dirty." He turned to Grace. "You keep copies of those test results somewhere safe." Grace gave a faint smile. "Already did. There's a duplicate at my lab." Eli caught the subtle exchange between them, a spark of shared understanding that made him uneasy. He trusted Nolan, but he'd seen too many friends turn cautious when fear got involved. Still, it was all they had. 2 fronts: evidence above ground, secrets buried below. Later that afternoon, Grace drove back toward Cedar Bend, the wipers squealing against the windshield. Her Jeep jolted over ruts in the soaked dirt road. The rain had eased to a drizzle, but mist clung to the trees like smoke. She had a second folder on the passenger seat, marked with the words, "Triton Data, Copy B." She planned to lock it in her clinic safe until morning. Ranger wasn't with her this time. Eli had kept him close, uneasy about the SUV sightings. She tried to dismiss her nerves, focusing instead on the steady hum of the engine. Halfway through the forest road, her headlights caught movement, a shape darting across the path. She hit the brakes. The Jeep skidded, fishtailing slightly before stopping. Through the rain-streaked glass, she saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. A man, tall and lean, wearing a soaked Helion jacket. It was Lang, Cole Habers's silent partner. His face was pale, eyes wide as if caught in conflict between duty and conscience. He raised a hand, not to threaten, but to warn. "Dr. Harlow," he called, voice muffled by the rain. "They're coming. Turn back." Before she could respond, the roar of another engine echoed behind her. Headlights flared in the mirror. A second SUV sped into view, its tires hurling mud as it closed the distance. Grace's pulse spiked. She shifted into gear, slammed the accelerator, and the Jeep lurched forward. Lang shouted something lost in the storm as the black vehicle gave chase. Branches whipped at her windows as the forest narrowed around the road. The SUV gained fast, its lights filling her mirrors. Then, a sharp crack split the air, a gunshot. The back window shattered. Grace ducked instinctively, gripping the wheel tighter. She swerved, tires slipping in the mud. The folder on the seat slid to the floor. At that moment, out of the trees, a dark blur burst through the rain. Ranger. The dog launched himself at the pursuing vehicle, teeth flashing as he struck the driver's side. The SUV veered off course, crashing into a ditch with a scream of twisting metal. Grace slammed the brakes and jumped out, heart hammering. Ranger limped toward her, wet and shaking, but alive, his fur matted with mud. "God, Ranger!" she gasped, dropping to her knees beside him. The dog pressed his head against her arm, panting heavily but wagging his tail. Eli arrived minutes later, his truck sliding to a halt. He'd followed her when she didn't answer his calls. His face was pale under the rain, his flannel soaked through. "You all right?" Grace nodded breathlessly. "They were following me," Lang tried to warn me. Eli's gaze flicked to the wrecked SUV, where smoke curled from the engine. "Helion!" He knelt, checking Ranger's leg. "You saved her again, boy." The dog barked weakly, pressing closer to Eli. The sight made something tighten in Grace's chest. She watched Eli's face soften for the first time since they'd met, a warmth she hadn't expected behind the hardened marine exterior. Back in the truck, silence filled the space between them as the rain softened into a mist. Eli finally spoke. "You know, my father used to say the Navy emblem was more than a badge. He said it meant you carried the weight of the country on your back. But after Triton, it just felt like a curse." Grace turned toward him. "Maybe it's not a curse anymore," she said gently. "Maybe it's the key to saving this place, to clearing his name." Eli looked out the window, where the flagpole outside the old ranch still stood, bent and clase, rusted. "Then that's what we'll do," he said quietly. "We'll bring the truth back into the light." Ranger raised his head, pressing his muzzle against Eli's shoulder, as if in agreement. Outside, the last roll of thunder faded into the distance, and for a brief moment, Red Hollow seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next strike. The night fell hard over Red Hollow, thick with wind and the smell of coming rain. The farmhouse stood silent against the horizon, its windows dark, its flagpole still bent from the last storm. Inside, Eli and Grace packed the last of their files into a weatherproof case. Ranger paced restlessly near the door, his claws clicking against the wooden floor. Something in the air too still, too charged, made his fur stand on end. Sheriff Nolan had left an hour earlier, promising to bring backup in the morning to transport the evidence to the state office. Grace glanced toward the window, unease shadowing her eyes. "You think they'll come tonight?" she asked. Eli didn't answer. He was checking his father's recorder again, adjusting the wires so the tape would play clearly when the time came. "They can't afford to wait," he said finally. "Helion won't risk a courtroom. They'll burn the truth before it ever reaches daylight." A low growl cut through the wind. Ranger stood rigid, facing the door. Eli moved to the window. Far off, across the pasture, the faint glow of headlights flickered between the trees. "They're here." He grabbed his jacket and the camera Grace used for field documentation. "Stay close." Outside, the cold bit through the flannel on his shoulders. The rain hadn't started yet, but the air smelled of gasoline. Ranger led the way, nose low, his silhouette framed in the beam of Eli's flashlight. They reached the edge of the barn, just as the first explosion thundered through the night. The blast threw heat and debris skyward. The east field was ablaze. Grace gasped, hand covering her mouth. "They're torching it!" From the flames emerged figures in dark tactical gear, faces hidden behind visors. One of them carried a red canister. Eli recognized the gait, the confident stride of someone who didn't need to hide. Cole Havers stepped into the firelight, his face half lit, jaw clenched, eyes gleaming like steel. "Evening, Morgan," he called. "You should have listened." Eli stepped forward, rain hissing as it met the spreading fire. "You think burning it changes what you did?" Cole smirked. "It changes everything. No records, no evidence, just a tragic accident lightning strike maybe." He lifted his pistol, gesturing toward the house. "Walk away, and maybe we forget you were part of this mess." Before Eli could respond, Ranger lunged. The dog hit one of the masked men at the flank, teeth sinking into the man's arm. Chaos erupted. Another shot rang out, hitting the side of the barn. Flames leapt higher, swallowing the hayloft. Eli ducked behind the tractor, pulling Grace with him. "Run!" he shouted, but she shook her head. Her camera was already on, recording the chaos, the men, the flames. Cole standing before the burning fields. Cole advanced, the fire reflecting off his pale eyes. "You want a story, Doctor?" he said, his voice a hiss beneath the roar of the flames. "Then tell them this. Project Triton never ended. It was reborn. The Navy just changed the name." Grace caught it all on tape. Eli rose, fists clenched. "Say it again," he demanded, stepping into the light. Cole hesitated, eyes narrowing, realizing too late what was happening. Grace's camera light blinked red, recording. He lunged forward, but Ranger was faster, tackling him to the ground. The pistol flew from Cole's hand, clattering across the dirt. Eli pinned him down, the heat from the fire scorching their skin. "Who ordered it?" Eli growled. "Who's behind this?" Cole struggled, the mask of confidence cracking under the weight of his own words. "You don't understand," he gasped. "Triton wasn't just a project, it was a contingency. Your father tried to shut it down, but the core he couldn't." A burst of gunfire cut through the night. Cole's words died in his throat. Lang, his young partner, stood near the SUV, gun still smoking, eyes wide with shock. "They would have killed you," Lang shouted over the fire. "Both of you." Before anyone could move, sirens wailed in the distance. Sheriff Nolan's cruiser came barreling down the road, lights cutting through the smoke. Two deputies jumped out, weapons drawn. "Hands where we can see them," Nolan barked. Lang dropped his pistol immediately, stepping back with trembling hands. Cole, dazed and bleeding, looked at Eli with something almost like regret. As the deputies cuffed the agents, the fire devoured what was left of the barn. Grace turned her camera toward the field. Amid the flames, a familiar shape gleamed the steel hatch. The fire had stripped the earth around it bare, revealing the Navy emblem still intact. The eagle and anchor shone red in the firelight, its edges glowing as if alive. Eli stood watching, the reflection of the flames flickering in his eyes. "They tried to bury it," he said softly, "but they couldn't." Ranger pressed, close to his leg. Panting hard, his fur singed at the tips. Grace took his hand, squeezing gently. "Then let it burn," she whispered. "Let the lies burn with it." When dawn came, all that remained of the Morgan Ranch was a field of blackened ash and the emblem half buried, still glimmering like a relic of a forgotten war. Spring arrived slowly in Red Hollow, like a long-forgotten promise. The valley that had once smelled of ash now carried the scent of thawing earth and pine. The blackened field where Eli's ranch had stood was greening again, small shoots pushing through the soot. It had been 3 months since the fire, 3 months since the world learned the truth about Project Triton. What had started as a local tragedy had become a national reckoning. The story, Grace's footage, Cole's confession, and the Navy emblem gleaming in the flames spread across every major network. The footage was impossible to ignore. The Department of Defense was forced to reopen the Triton files, and within weeks, congressional hearings began. Eli stood in a borrowed suit before a sea of microphones at the state capitol. He hated cameras. They reminded him of the glare of battlefield spotlights, too bright, too revealing. The scar on his left hand, still raw from the fire, itched as he adjusted his tie. Beside him, Grace Harlow spoke clearly into the press microphones, her voice steady and precise. She wore a dark blazer, her copper hair gathered neatly, but the sun caught strands of gold as she talked about environmental recovery and accountability. "This isn't just about radiation or water," she said. "It's about truth, and about those who tried to protect it, not bury it." Ranger sat between them, calm and alert, a silver medal hanging from his collar. The dog's fur had grown back thick and glossy, the burn scars hidden beneath his coat. He was older now, his muzzle dusted with white, but his eyes still carried that sharp amber intelligence. When the cameras clicked, he turned his head slightly, dignified, as if he understood the ceremony was not just for humans. After the conference, Eli and Grace walked the steps of the Capitol together. The crowd applauded softly as they passed veterans, townspeople, and strangers who had come to thank them. Sheriff Nolan Pike stood near the edge of the stairs, hat in hand, his uniform newly pressed. His lined face softened when he saw Eli. "You did good, son," he said, clapping a heavy hand on his shoulder. "Your old man would have been proud." Eli nodded, his throat tightening. He was the one who tried to stop it first. "I just finished what he started." "Maybe," Nolan said, looking toward the horizon. "But sometimes finishing takes more courage than beginning." That evening, Grace drove Eli and Ranger back to Red Hollow. The valley had changed cleanup, teams had cleared the contamination, and a new reservoir shimmered where the poisoned water once flowed. It was fed by underground springs finally freed of their toxic residue. Grace had worked tirelessly to secure funding for its restoration, founding the Triton Renewal Fund, a foundation dedicated to water preservation and veterans' rehabilitation. Its emblem, a reversed Navy insignia, symbolized not conquest but repentance. When they reached the site of the old ranch, the sun was setting. The charred ruins had been replaced with a memorial garden overlooking the lake. In the center stood a steel plaque mounted on a stone base. The old emblem had been recast, its wings upturned instead of down. Below it was engraved, "For those who fought not to destroy, but to protect." Eli stood silently for a long moment. The air was cool, and the surface of the water rippled with the wind. Grace stepped beside him, hands in her coat pockets. "They're calling it Morgan Lake," she said softly, "after your father." He smiled faintly, eyes glistening. He'd have hated that. He never wanted his name on anything. "Then this isn't about his name," Grace replied. "It's about what he stood for." Ranger trotted forward, nose to the plaque, sniffing curiously before sitting beside it. The breeze ruffled his fur, and his tail swept slowly against the grass. Eli knelt beside him, resting a hand on the dog's head. The warmth of his companion's heartbeat pressed against his palm, a reminder of all that had survived the fire. "You did good, boy," Eli murmured. "Better than all of us." Ranger leaned into his touch, eyes half closed, calm. Grace turned to leave them for a moment of quiet. The water caught the colors of the dying sun, burning gold and crimson like the memory of the fire that had once consumed the land. For the first time in years, Eli felt peace. The emblem gleamed faintly against the fading light, no longer a symbol of shame, but of redemption. He looked toward the horizon where the hills met the sky, where his father had once stood decades ago. "Now you can rest, Dad," he whispered. "Under the same flag you believed in." The last light of day reflected across the lake, catching on the surface until it looked like molten silver, alive, breathing, renewed. Ranger barked softly, a single, low sound that echoed through the still air. And as dusk settled over Red Hollow, the spring beneath the flag shimmered, alive again. Sometimes miracles don't come as thunder from the heavens, They arrive quietly, in the loyalty of a dog, the forgiveness of a heart, or the courage to begin again. Just as Eli found redemption beneath the ashes, we too can find grace in our own trials if we trust the light God plants within us. May this story remind you that no wound is wasted when faith endures. If it touched your soul, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment about what miracle you've witnessed, and subscribe to our channel to keep these stories of love and redemption alive. May the Lord bless you and those you cherish, and may His gentle hand guide your every step toward healing.